Owen Reed had spent his entire adult life chasing the idea of peace. After 3 decades in construction management, countless deadlines, sleepless nights, and boardroom battles that left him questioning whether anyone in the world still valued integrity, he finally walked away. He bought a 2-story farmhouse on the edge of the suburbs, nestled against a stretch of pine forest and a quiet private road that wound like a forgotten ribbon through the trees. That road, as far as he was concerned, was his. It came with a property deed, meticulously documented, and he had paid a small fortune to repave and maintain it himself. For Owen, that stretch of asphalt represented more than convenience. It was the physical boundary between the chaos of the world and the quiet life he had earned. He often sat on his porch at dusk, coffee mug in hand, watching the last rays of sun vanish behind the tree line and feeling a rare, grounded sense of control over something that was truly his own. He had never been one for neighborhood politics. The local homeowners association, the Silver Pines Community Board, as it proudly called itself, had reached out to him several times with invitations to attend meetings, join committees, or contribute to collective beautification efforts. He declined every one of them politely but firmly. He didn't move out here to paint fences beige or argue over mailbox colors. He valued his independence too much to be tangled in petty suburban power plays. The president of the HOA, a woman named Marina Howell, seemed to take his refusals personally. She was the type who smiled too wide and measured her power in the number of people who bowed to her rules. Every time Owen saw her white SUV rolling past his driveway, clipboard in hand, he felt that instinctive twinge of irritation reserved for people who thrived on control. He could tell from the very beginning that Marina didn't like boundaries she didn't set herself. For a while, though, life was exactly what Owen had hoped for. His mornings were quiet, filled with the sound of birds and the occasional hum of his old pickup truck. He tended to his small vegetable garden, worked on woodworking projects in the garage, and slowly began to forget the noise of the world he had left behind. But tranquility, as he would soon learn, is fragile, especially when it stands in the way of someone else's agenda. It began subtly. A month into the new school year, Owen noticed the faint rumble of engines echoing down the hill earlier than usual. At first, he thought it was construction work on a nearby street, but as the sound grew louder, he walked out to his gate and saw something that made his stomach tighten. A bright yellow school bus, followed by another and then another, rolling down his private road in a neat, orderly line. The drivers waved as if nothing was wrong, the wheels crushing fallen pine needles and scattering dust into the air. For a moment, Owen just stood there, baffled, watching as they disappeared around the bend and onto the main road again. He had never given permission for anyone to use that road, let alone a fleet of heavy vehicles. The next morning, it happened again, and the next. Confused but not yet angry, Owen drove down to the local school district office to ask about the rerouting. A young clerk behind the counter smiled awkwardly and told him that the buses had been redirected per HOA approval. When he explained that he wasn't a member of the HOA and that the road was legally his, she shrugged, clearly out of her depth, and handed him a printed notice stamped with the HOA's logo. Temporary route adjustment for community efficiency, it read in bold type. Beneath that was a line that made his pulse quicken. Approved by Silver Pines, HOA President Marina Howell. By the time Owen got home that afternoon, the edges of his calm had already begun to fray. He paced his driveway, staring at the grooves the bus's tires had left in the gravel. He had paid thousands for the upkeep of this road, and now strangers were using it without his consent. He called the HOA office, demanding an explanation. Marina herself answered, her voice smooth, practiced, and dripping with condescension. She told him that the board had collectively decided the new route was safer and shorter for the children in the neighborhood, and that the use of his road benefited everyone. When Owen pointed out that it was his property, her tone shifted slightly, becoming sharper, colder. "Sometimes," she said, "individual interests have to yield to community needs. I'm sure a reasonable man like you understands that." Owen hung up without another word. He stood for a long while in the middle of his driveway, the late afternoon sun burning against his shoulders, his jaw locked tight. There was something in Marina's voice, a smug certainty that she could do whatever she pleased, that crawled under his skin. He had dealt with people like her before, people who hid their ambition behind polite phrases and paperwork. But this time, it wasn't business. This was his home, his land, and his boundary. And as the next school bus roared down his road, shaking the windows of his living room, Owen Reed felt the quiet life he had built begin to crack, piece by piece. The next week turned Owen's irritation into something darker. Each morning, before the sun had fully lifted above the trees, the school buses came thundering down his private road, their diesel engines growling through the still air, their weight pressing fresh grooves into the asphalt he had repaved with his own money. The vibrations rattled his window panes and sent the birds scattering from the pines. The first few days, he stood by the window, arms folded, telling himself it was temporary, some logistical mistake that would soon be corrected. But then came the letter. It was tucked neatly into his mailbox one crisp Thursday morning, printed on glossy paper bearing the HOA's insignia in gold. The heading read, "Notice of temporary easement for community transit." His name was nowhere on it. There was no request, no form for consent, just a flat declaration that, effective immediately, his private road would serve as an approved secondary route for school transport vehicles under the authority of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association. Owen read it 3 times, each word feeling heavier than the last. They had called it an easement, a word that in legal terms meant access, permission, rights, but it was neither requested nor granted. They had taken what wasn't theirs and wrapped it in bureaucratic language. The notice even included a line that made his jaw tighten. In cases where private property serves a greater public function, implied consent shall be assumed unless formally contested. Implied consent. That phrase was a weapon disguised as courtesy, and it infuriated him. He drove straight to the HOA office that same afternoon, his heartbeat steady, but his patience already thin. The office was in a refurbished townhouse at the edge of the neighborhood, all white walls, scented candles, and artificial smiles. Marina Howell stood behind the front desk when he entered, wearing her signature beige blazer and that same expression of professional superiority that had always made him think of someone who smiled only for mirrors. "Mr. Reed," she greeted smoothly, as if she had been expecting him. "I assume you received our notice?" "I did," he replied, holding up the letter. "And I assume you realize this is illegal. That road is my property. You don't have the right to reroute anything through it." Marina clasped her hands on the desk, her tone infuriatingly calm. "We've reviewed the zoning maps and the original development plan. Technically, your road was part of the community's infrastructure before your parcel was privatized. It's an understandable oversight, but we're just using it temporarily to assist with student transportation. Surely you wouldn't deny the children a safe route to school." Owen stared at her for a long moment, studying her perfectly painted smile. "You're not asking," he said finally. "You're telling. There's a difference." Her eyes hardened just a fraction, the faintest crack in her mask. "Mr. Reed, sometimes cooperation benefits everyone. Resistance only complicates matters." He left before she could finish her sentence. Outside, the air was cool, sharp with the scent of pine, but it did little to calm the heat rising in his chest. He had dealt with manipulative people before, developers, lawyers, contractors. But this was different. This was home, and someone was trying to turn it into a public thoroughfare. Over the next few days, the situation escalated in ways that felt deliberately cruel. He began receiving anonymous notes in his mailbox, written in neat, careful handwriting. "Stop being selfish," one said. "You're the reason kids are late for school." Read another. A neighbor he barely knew, an older woman named Helen, whose lawn looked like it had been measured with a ruler, walked by one morning and muttered, "It's always the loners who cause problems." Owen didn't respond. He didn't need to. The sudden shift in how people looked at him told him everything. Marina had already turned the neighborhood against him. When he called the city transportation office to file a complaint, they told him the route had been approved in cooperation with local community leadership. He asked them who that leadership was, and the clerk simply replied, "The Silver Pines HOA." He demanded to know whether anyone had verified ownership of the road. The line went silent for a long moment before the clerk said quietly, "You'll have to take that up with them." Then the call disconnected. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table with a stack of papers spread before him, his deed, his maintenance invoices, and the official property map from the county assessor. Every document confirmed what he already knew. The road, from gate to intersection, was private land registered in his name. He even found the line item for it on his property tax statement, clear as day. Yet somehow, those facts meant nothing to the people determined to ignore them. The next morning, Owen stood at the end of his driveway as the buses came rumbling down once again. The drivers slowed slightly when they saw him, unsure whether to wave or look away. Their faces reflected a discomfort that told him they knew this wasn't right either. When the last bus passed, Owen walked down the road, inspecting the deep tire grooves, the cracks spreading across the pavement, and the litter left behind. Juice boxes, a candy wrapper, a broken pencil. He felt an anger rising in him that wasn't just about property or principle. It was about being dismissed, overridden, erased. That afternoon, he printed large signs that read, "Private road, no unauthorized access," and placed them at both entrances. The next morning, the signs were gone. Torn down, the metal poles bent as if by deliberate force. He found fresh tracks where someone had driven over the grass to avoid the gate entirely. That was when he realized it wasn't just bureaucracy anymore. It was defiance. Someone wanted to prove that he couldn't stop them. Later that evening, just as the sun dipped low behind the trees, a white SUV pulled into his driveway. Marina stepped out, immaculate as ever, clutching a clipboard. She smiled that same hollow smile and called out, "Mr. Reed, we really should talk about this before it becomes unpleasant." "It's already unpleasant," he replied, voice even but tight. "You're trespassing." She ignored that. "You're being unreasonable. The board discussed this matter and you were outvoted. The road is now considered a shared community passage until further notice. If you obstruct it, you'll be in violation of HOA regulations and possibly subject to fines." He took a slow step forward, close enough that her perfume, something floral and artificial, cut through the cool air. "I don't answer to your board, I don't pay your fees, and I don't live under your rules. Now get off my property." For the first time, her composure faltered. "You might want to reconsider that attitude," she said softly. "Defiance has consequences." Then she turned and left, her SUV's headlights cutting twin beams through the dusk as it rolled back toward the main road. Owen stood there long after she was gone, the sound of crickets filling the space she'd left behind. He looked down the length of his road, the one he'd built, paid for, and cared for, now scarred with heavy tire marks and fading daylight. He had thought retirement would mean peace, but as he stood there in the quiet that no longer felt like solitude, only encroachment, he realized something had shifted irrevocably. This wasn't about convenience for children or the greater good of the community. It was about power, about someone testing how far they could push before he pushed back. and as the last light disappeared beyond the trees, Owen Reed made a silent promise to himself. He would not yield another inch. By the end of that week, Owen's quiet resistance had turned into open defiance. He began documenting everything. Every bus that passed, every tire mark that scarred the asphalt, every new flyer the HOA pinned to his mailbox. The cameras he installed on the edge of his property captured the daily parade of vehicles, the occasional pedestrian cutting across his lawn to save a few steps, and even, one night, 2 men in reflective vests who arrived just after midnight to remove one of his private road signs again. They worked quickly and efficiently, like people who knew they were doing something they shouldn't. The footage was crystal clear, and when Owen zoomed in, he could see the HOA logo stitched on the back of their jackets. He printed screenshots, labeled them by date, and added them to a growing binder of evidence. He didn't intend to shout or threaten. He intended to prove, once and for all, that his rights were being violated. But the harder he pushed for clarity, the more the neighborhood turned on him. At the grocery store, conversation stopped when he entered. His next-door neighbor, a man who once borrowed Owen's power tools and returned them with a friendly smile, now avoided eye contact entirely. A mother walking her child home from school pulled the kid closer when she saw him standing by the mailbox, whispering something that made the boy glance at Owen with a mixture of fear and confusion. It was as though Marina had managed to rewrite his identity overnight, transforming him from the quiet retiree who minded his own business into some villainous recluse hoarding a piece of land the community desperately needed. One morning, as he left to pick up mail, he found a piece of paper pinned under a rock near his driveway. The handwriting was neat, the message short but venomous. "You can't stop progress. Sell and leave before things get worse." He read it twice, his hand tightening around the paper until it crumpled. He wasn't the kind of man who scared easily, but there was something in the tone, the certainty, the entitlement, that unsettled him. He began to sense that this wasn't just a local dispute anymore. Someone, somewhere, had decided his property was expendable and everyone else was merely playing their part. He decided to take the issue directly to the county office, carrying with him copies of his deed, the tax records, and the binder of photos. The clerk who met him there, a young man with polite eyes and nervous energy, listened patiently at first, but then hesitated. "Mr. Reed," he said quietly, "technically, your road is listed as private, but the HOA filed a community access request months ago, apparently under an old development clause that wasn't properly closed when your parcel was privatized. They claim it's a gray area, and until the case is reviewed, the route stands." Owen's patience finally snapped. "A gray area," he said, his voice low but sharp. "There's nothing gray about a property deed. Either it's mine or it's not." The clerk sighed, clearly sympathetic but powerless. "I understand, sir, but the process takes time. You could file a formal objection with a property rights attorney." "I already have one," Owen interrupted. The next day, his lawyer, a pragmatic woman named Laura Bennett, met him at his home. She reviewed the documents carefully, her brow furrowing as she flipped through the HOA notice. "They're overreaching," she said after a few minutes. "That temporary easement is fabricated. There's no legal standing here unless you consented, which you didn't. They're gambling that you'll get tired of fighting." Owen exhaled slowly, the tightness in his chest easing for the first time in days. "So what do we do?" "We make noise," Laura replied. "Paper trails, complaints to the city, copies to the county assessor, the transportation department, and the media if necessary. They want silence and compliance. We'll give them neither." For the first time, Owen felt like he had a plan, but his relief was short-lived. That same evening, a new letter appeared in his mailbox. This one not from the HOA, but from the school district's transportation office. It informed him that, due to community feedback, Any attempt to block or restrict the bus route would be reported as an obstruction of a public service. The phrase, "subject to penalties," was bolded and underlined. He felt his stomach twist as he read it. Someone was escalating. Someone wanted to make him the villain in an official record. The following morning, when he came outside, he noticed something strange. Faint white paint marks along the edge of the road, spaced evenly every few feet. Surveyor's lines. His heart sank. He knew what they meant. Someone was preparing to argue that the road fell under shared jurisdiction. He knelt to inspect one of the marks, brushing away pine needles, and noticed initials sprayed beside it. SPHOA. They were staking his land like it was already theirs. By the end of the week, his road had become a spectacle. Cars slowed as they passed, neighbors whispering from open windows. Someone had taken photos of his closed gate and posted them online with the caption, "Selfish homeowner endangers kids for the sake of his pride." The comments were vicious. People he had never met accused him of greed, bitterness, even cruelty. One local blogger called him a relic of old America who can't handle sharing. The post was shared hundreds of times before sunset. When Owen read it, he felt something deeper than anger, a sense of disbelief that the truth could be so easily buried under lies. Late one evening, as he was reviewing his security footage, a movement on the screen caught his eye. A shadow passed near the edge of the property, stopping at his gate. He rewound the footage and zoomed in. It was Marina. She was standing there under the streetlight, alone, holding her phone and speaking quietly into it. The expression on her face wasn't one of frustration or negotiation. It was satisfaction. She looked at the gate as though she had already won, as though this stretch of land would soon belong to her, too. Owen stepped outside, the cool night air biting against his skin. He didn't call out to her, didn't want the confrontation to unfold on her terms. Instead, he stood silently at the edge of the porch, just watching her. When she noticed him, she smiled faintly, gave a little wave, and turned back toward her car. The SUV's taillights flared red as she drove off into the night, leaving only the distant echo of her tires against his road. The same road she claimed belonged to everyone but him. When he went back inside, he poured himself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the faint reflection of his face in the window. He thought about the way power operated, quietly, insidiously, without confrontation at first. It didn't take property by force. It took it by paperwork, rumor, and exhaustion. But Owen Reed wasn't built to surrender. He had spent his life working with men who tried to bully him through contracts and threats, and he had learned one unshakable rule. People who rely on manipulation hate exposure more than resistance. So he made a decision. He would give Marina Howell exactly what she didn't want: visibility. Every conversation would be recorded, every letter copied, every visit documented. If they wanted a fight, they would get one. As he closed the binder filled with evidence and turned off the light, he looked once more out the window at the road that had started it all. Under the dim glow of the porch light, the asphalt gleamed like a black scar through the pines. It wasn't just property anymore. It was a line drawn in the dirt, and he was ready to defend it. The first serious breakthrough came unexpectedly, late on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Laura Bennett called and told Owen to meet her at her office as soon as possible. Her voice carried a subtle edge that made him leave immediately, driving through sheets of rain that blurred the road into a silver ribbon. When he arrived, Laura was standing by the window, her desk covered in papers and open files. Without a word, she handed him a folder marked County Infrastructure Review, Silver Pines District. Inside were several scanned documents, and even at a glance, Owen saw what she wanted him to notice. A map, printed with clean lines and digital signatures, showed his property outlined clearly in green. The private road, marked with the same boundary, extended from his driveway to the main intersection, registered under his name. But beneath that map was another version, dated 2 months later, where the road had been recolored in gray and labeled Shared Access Corridor, pending reclassification. There was no approval signature from him, no record of consent, but there was one name stamped in bold on the bottom. Marina Howell, HOA President. Laura spoke before he could even form the words. They submitted a reclassification request without notifying you, and someone in the planning department accepted it as uncontested. That's how the buses were rerouted legally, at least on paper. They used a clause intended for abandoned roads without active owners. According to this form, your road was marked as inactive property. Owen stared at the papers, his pulse hammering in his temples. Inactive. I've been living there for 3 years. I pay taxes on that road every year. How can it be inactive? Because someone didn't want to check, Laura said grimly. Or because someone told them not to. The realization hit like a slow, cold tide. It wasn't incompetence. It was collusion. Someone within the county office had helped the HOA push this through, banking on the assumption that a retired man living quietly in the woods wouldn't have the resources or endurance to dig through layers of municipal deceit. But they underestimated him. He leaned forward, hands gripping the edge of her desk. Can we reverse it? Laura nodded, though her expression remained cautious. It's possible, but we'll need to expose the procedural fraud. I've already filed a request for the complete correspondence record between the HOA and the county. If we can prove that they falsified or withheld your ownership data, we can nullify the reclassification. The next few weeks blurred into a pattern of calls, documents, and sleepless nights. Owen became obsessed, combing through every folder he could find. Old property surveys, tax statements, and even handwritten letters from the previous owner that confirmed the road had always been private. He learned more about zoning law in 2 weeks than he'd ever wanted to know. But the deeper he dug, the uglier the picture became. He discovered that Marina had been lobbying for years to standardize the private sections of Silver Pines into public routes to increase property values and attract new investors. She had nearly succeeded twice before, but both attempts had been blocked by homeowners who refused to sign off. Owen realized he was the last obstacle standing between her and complete control of the development plan. The hostility from neighbors intensified. His mailbox was vandalized one morning, the metal bent and stuffed with soggy newspaper. The next day, someone spray-painted the word "tyrant" on the back of his gate. At night, he could hear car engines idling near the edge of his property, young voices laughing, bottles clinking, the kind of petty intimidation that only felt more sinister because it was tolerated. He reported it to the police twice, but both times the officers arrived hours later and took notes with an indifference that bordered on contempt. One of them even mentioned, almost casually, that the HOA said you were causing trouble. It was clear which side had influence. Then, one morning, a thick envelope arrived at his door, hand-delivered and stamped with the HOA seal. It was a community complaint summary, accusing him of endangering residents, obstructing traffic, and failing to comply with neighborhood cooperation standards. Attached were photos of his closed gate, distorted by camera angles to make it look as though he was blocking the road completely. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it hadn't felt like another step in a calculated attempt to destroy his credibility. He called Laura immediately. "This is harassment," she said after scanning the letter. "They're trying to bait you into reacting. They want you angry enough to do something they can use against you." But Owen didn't need bait. He was already past anger. That night he sat in his living room with the curtains open, watching the rain streak across the glass as the faint glow of headlights passed by in the distance. He thought about Marina's words. Defiance has consequences. He finally understood what she meant. This wasn't just a territorial dispute. It was a war of endurance, and he had no intention of losing. 2 days later, Laura called again, her tone carrying the urgency of revelation. "We got the correspondence logs," she said. "You'll want to see this." The emails, printed and highlighted in yellow, left no doubt. Marina had exchanged direct messages with a county zoning officer named Harris, pushing him to fast-track the reclassification for safety reasons. One line stood out like a knife through paper. "The owner is uncooperative. Proceed as if property is inactive. No further communication needed." When Owen read it, he felt his hands tremble, not from fear, but from fury. "She lied to a government office," he said. "She falsified my ownership status." "Yes," Laura replied, "and that's a felony if we can prove it was intentional." The discovery reignited his determination. He spent the next week gathering affidavits from past residents, old homeowners who confirmed that the road had always been excluded from HOA jurisdiction. One elderly couple, the Parkers, even produced a dusty binder of original subdivision plans showing the property boundaries with a bold red line separating his parcel from community land. They had known Marina for years, they said, and they weren't surprised. "She's always been power-hungry," Mrs. Parker told him. "She thinks this whole neighborhood is her personal kingdom." While Laura prepared the legal motion to challenge the reclassification, Owen decided to test the limits of his patience and theirs. Early one morning, before the buses arrived, he closed his gate and placed a large sign across it reading, "Road under private maintenance. Authorized entry only." He parked his truck sideways across the entrance, not to provoke, but to make his point impossible to ignore. When the first bus appeared at the top of the hill, it stopped, lights flashing, unable to pass. Within minutes, parents began arriving, their voices rising, some shouting accusations while others filmed on their phones. Owen didn't respond. He simply stood there, calm and immovable, while the chaos unfolded. Eventually, a police car arrived. The officer, a young man clearly uncomfortable with the situation, approached cautiously. "Sir, the HOA says this is a community road," he began. Owen handed him a copy of his deed and the county tax statement. "That's my name. That's my property. They falsified documents. You're standing on private land right now." The officer read the papers, hesitated, then sighed. "I can't make a ruling on ownership. I'm just here to keep the peace." "Then keep it," Owen said quietly, stepping aside. "Because I'm not moving that truck until they admit what they've done." By noon, news vans had arrived. Someone had called the local media, and suddenly the private dispute was public. Reporters hovered near the police tape, asking questions about community conflict and property rights abuse. One headline later that day read, "HOA president faces backlash over private road dispute." Marina appeared on camera that evening, perfectly composed, claiming that Owen had misunderstood the situation and that the association was working toward a fair resolution. But the footage from his cameras told a different story. Laura advised him to stay quiet and let the evidence speak for itself. But that night, as he watched the recording of Marina's interview on the local news, he saw something in her eyes that unsettled him more than anger. Calculation. She wasn't defeated. She was regrouping. He knew it as clearly as he knew his own name. She would come back stronger, smarter, and with more people behind her. Still, for the first time since the buses began rolling down his road, Owen felt the balance shift, however slightly, in his favor. The lie had been exposed, the truth documented. The fight was far from over, but now it was visible, undeniable, and real. As the rain eased outside and thunder faded into the distance, He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling into his bones, and whispered to himself the words that had carried him through every hard moment of his life. "They can push, but I push back harder." The week after the media coverage was supposed to bring calm, but instead it unleashed a storm of retaliation that made Owen realize just how far Marina Howell was willing to go. For a few days, the buses stopped using his road, and he almost dared to believe the message had gotten through. The silence that followed was heavy, but welcome. Yet one morning, when he stepped outside to collect the mail, he found a large yellow notice taped to his gate, flapping in the wind like a flag of war. The bold letters across the top read, "Violation of community conduct, unsafe obstruction of access." Beneath that was a paragraph claiming he had endangered residents and children by blocking a designated route, citing fabricated sections of the HOA's bylaws and threatening him with fines of up to $5,000 per day until compliance was achieved. The bottom of the notice bore Marina's signature, written with a flourish that seemed almost taunting. Owen tore the paper from the gate, his pulse pounding. He had expected pushback, but not this level of audacity. They were now inventing rules for a man who wasn't even a member of their association. He called Laura immediately and read the notice aloud. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of disbelief in it. "They can't enforce those fines," she said. "They have no jurisdiction over you. This is psychological warfare, nothing more. But we can use this. It proves intent to harass. Keep every letter they send." By afternoon, 3 more identical notices appeared. One on his mailbox, one stapled to a tree near the road, and one slipped under his front door. That last one chilled him the most. It meant someone had walked up to his porch while he was inside. He began double-checking the locks each night, adjusting the motion lights, and scanning through the footage from his cameras before bed. Most nights showed nothing but wind through the trees or a passing raccoon. But 2 nights later, just after midnight, the cameras captured something that made his blood run cold. A car pulled up quietly near the end of his driveway, headlights off. 2 figures stepped out, walked to his gate, and began unscrewing the bolts that held one of the private property signs in place. They weren't kids. Their movements were deliberate, professional. When the lights from the motion sensor flickered on, they froze, exchanged a glance, and ran back to the car, disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, Owen found the sign half removed, the bolts still scattered in the gravel. That was the moment he realized this had gone beyond petty neighborhood politics. Someone was testing his limits, gauging how far they could go before he called the police. He did call them, this time demanding an incident report. The officer who arrived was polite but non-committal, advising him to avoid escalating and suggesting it might have been a misunderstanding. Owen almost laughed in disbelief. "A misunderstanding," he repeated. "At midnight, on private property, with tools in hand." The officer shrugged. "Just documenting the call, sir. We'll keep an eye out." It was clear he wouldn't. That evening, Laura arrived with new documents from the court. The county had acknowledged receipt of their fraud complaint, but the review process would take weeks, maybe months. "They're dragging it out," she said. "They always do. The HOA will keep pressuring you, hoping you'll crack before the ruling." She looked at him with quiet sympathy. "Are you holding up?" Owen nodded, though the truth was more complicated. Sleep came harder each night, and his thoughts looped endlessly between anger and exhaustion. The once tranquil home he'd built now felt like a battleground, every sound outside sparking suspicion. He started keeping a flashlight and a wrench by his bed, not because he expected an attack, but because he refused to be caught off guard again. A few days later, the confrontation became public again. Marina organized an emergency HOA community meeting at the clubhouse, which Owen discovered only because a flyer had been taped to his mailbox. The headline read, "Discussion on Road Safety and Community Cooperation." He attended, uninvited but determined, standing at the back of the room as Marina spoke at the podium, her tone dripping with performative concern. "It's unfortunate," she said, "that one resident has chosen to put personal pride above the safety of our children. We're all part of one community, and we must hold each other accountable." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Owen waited until she finished before stepping forward. The room fell into uneasy silence. "Accountable?" he said, his voice steady but hard. "You mean lying, falsifying property records, and trespassing?" Marina's smile didn't falter, though her knuckles whitened on the podium. "Mr. Reed, please, this isn't the place for hostility." "This is exactly the place," he replied. "You manipulated the county, forged documentation, and used public resources to invade my property, and you did it under the guise of helping children. You're not protecting anyone, you're exploiting them." A few gasps echoed through the room, but Marina quickly regained her composure. "You're confused," she said smoothly. "The documents were processed through official channels. If there was an error, it wasn't ours." Owen pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket, the email between Marina and the zoning officer. "This says otherwise." He handed it to one of the attending city representatives, who scanned it with raised brows. The tension in the room thickened. Marina's expression remained neutral, but a faint flush crept into her cheeks. "This meeting is adjourned," she said abruptly, gathering her papers and leaving through the side door. By the time Owen returned home, he was both triumphant and uneasy. Exposing her publicly had felt satisfying, but he knew it also meant she'd come after him harder. The victory was short-lived. That night, his power went out. He walked through the darkened house with a flashlight, checking the breakers, but everything inside was intact. When he stepped outside, he saw that the line connecting his property to the main grid had been cut clean through. Someone had deliberately severed it. He reported it, but the power company said repairs might take days. As he sat in the candlelight, the weight of isolation pressed in on him, thick and suffocating. He wasn't just being pressured, he was being cornered. The next morning, Marina sent another notice, this time accusing him of willful obstruction of community utilities. It was absurd, infuriatingly bold, but part of him had to admire her tenacity. She was relentless, and she knew how to use the system as a weapon. That same afternoon, he found tire tracks in the mud near his back fence and footprints leading toward the woods. He followed them for several yards before they disappeared, swallowed by the pine needles. Standing there, listening to the distant hum of the highway, he realized there was no turning back now. Whatever line had once existed between legal conflict and personal vendetta had been erased. Laura came by that evening, bringing with her an envelope from the court. "The hearing's been expedited," she said. "They scheduled it for next week. Someone must have noticed the press coverage." She paused, studying him. "But you need to be careful, Owen. They're not just fighting for control anymore. They're fighting to destroy your credibility. You can't let them bait you." Owen nodded slowly, staring out the window at the faint silhouette of his gate illuminated by moonlight. He thought about everything that had happened, the vandalism, the lies, the intimidation, and felt a strange calm settle over him. The fear that had once gripped him was gone, replaced by a cold, deliberate resolve. "They've already crossed every line," he said quietly. "Now it's my turn." The courtroom was smaller than Owen expected, its fluorescent lights humming faintly above rows of worn benches. The air carried that familiar scent of old paper and cold coffee, and every word seemed to echo a little too loudly. He sat beside Laura at the petitioner's table, his binder of documents neatly stacked in front of him like armor. Across the aisle, Marina Howell looked as immaculate as ever. Beige suit, composed expression, hands folded primly on the table. She greeted the judge with the same pleasant smile she used on her neighbors, as if she were attending a charity brunch rather than a hearing that could expose her scheme. But her eyes, when they met Owen's, held no warmth, only quiet, simmering hostility. Judge Ramirez, a woman with an expression of sharp intelligence and little patience for theatrics, called the hearing to order. Laura began by presenting the foundation of the case: the property deed, the tax records, and the reclassification request Marina had filed. Each exhibit landed with the precision of a hammer strike. Owen watched the judge's brow furrow slightly as Laura outlined the timeline, from the falsified, inactive designation to the HOA's decision to reroute school buses through private property without consent. When she finished, she stepped aside and handed the judge a copy of the emails between Marina and the county official, her voice calm but firm. "This was not an administrative error, Your Honor. It was a deliberate act of deception." Marina's attorney, a slick man in an expensive navy suit, rose from his seat with a practiced smile. He spoke with the rehearsed ease of someone used to twisting logic into ribbons. "Your Honor," he began, "this is simply a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. The HOA acted under the belief that the road in question was part of the community easement system. My client had no malicious intent. She was acting in good faith for the safety and benefit of the neighborhood." Owen clenched his jaw. The phrase, "good faith," felt like poison in his ears. Laura countered smoothly, her tone clipped but controlled. "Good faith does not include falsifying ownership records, submitting unauthorized documents, and mobilizing city services under fraudulent pretense. My client has endured months of harassment, property damage, and defamation, all rooted in this fabricated narrative of community good." The judge turned to Marina, who maintained her poised smile but avoided eye contact. "Mrs. Howell, did you at any point receive written consent from Mr. Reed to authorize use of his road?" The silence that followed was thick. Marina's lawyer shifted uneasily before responding on her behalf. "Your Honor, consent was implied based on—" "Implied consent is not legal consent," the judge interrupted sharply. "Answer the question." Marina's voice, when it came, was soft but edged with irritation. "No, Your Honor, but we acted under guidance from the zoning department." Laura immediately produced the email chain where Marina had written, "Proceed as if property is inactive. No further communication needed." The judge read it slowly, her lips tightening. She looked up, eyes narrowing. "So, you gave that guidance yourself?" Marina's silence was answer enough. The tension in the room deepened. Owen could feel his heartbeat in his ears, but he stayed silent, letting Laura's precision dismantle the defense piece by piece. When the judge finally asked if Owen wished to speak, he hesitated, then stood. His voice, steady but heavy with restrained anger, carried through the quiet. "Your Honor, this isn't about fences or roads. It's about someone deciding that the law applies to everyone but them. For months, I've been called selfish, threatened, and treated like I don't belong in my own home. They didn't just take my property. They tried to take my peace, my reputation, and my name. I did everything the right way. I paid for that road, I maintained it, and I followed every rule that applied to me. But when that wasn't convenient for them, they rewrote the rules. If this stands, it means any person with enough influence can take what's yours and call it community service." When he sat back down, the silence lingered like a held breath. Marina's lawyer made a few final attempts to mitigate the damage, arguing technicalities, but it was clear the tide had turned. Judge Ramirez leaned back in her chair, her tone even but decisive. "The evidence shows clear misconduct on the part of the HOA and its representatives. The reclassification request was fraudulent, and any access granted under it is hereby void. The property in question remains under the sole ownership of Mr. Reed. Furthermore, this court finds grounds for damages due to harassment and defamation, which may be pursued in a separate civil claim. Marina's composure cracked for the first time, a faint twitch at the corner of her mouth, a tightening of her hands. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but she barely moved. The gavel struck once, the sound final and resonant. Outside the courthouse, the air was cool and clear, sunlight glinting off the wet pavement from a morning shower. Reporters clustered by the steps, shouting questions. Owen ignored them, stepping into the open air with Laura beside him. For a long moment, he simply stood there, breathing, the weight that had pressed against his chest for months finally beginning to lift. It wasn't triumph, he felt exactly. It was relief, tempered by exhaustion. He knew the battle had cost him pieces of himself that wouldn't return easily. As they walked toward his truck, Laura looked at him and smiled faintly. "You did it. Most people would have given up a long time ago." Owen shook his head. "It shouldn't take this much to defend what's yours." He glanced back at the courthouse, where Marina emerged moments later, surrounded by cameras and questions she didn't answer. For the first time, she looked smaller, stripped of the authority she had worn like armor. He drove home in silence, the road stretching out before him like a long exhale. When he reached his gate, he stopped, resting his hand on the cool metal. The trees whispered above, the air still and quiet, as though the land itself was finally at peace again. He knew Marina would face consequences, investigations, maybe even charges, but that was no longer his concern. He had done what he set out to do. He had drawn a line, and he had held it. As he stepped through the gate and into his yard, the gravel crunching under his boots, he felt something he hadn't felt in months: belonging. The fight had scarred him, but it had also reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten: the value of standing his ground, no matter the cost. The buses would find another route, the neighbors would gossip for a while, and the HOA would lick its wounds. But the road, the quiet, narrow road that had started it all, was his once more, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed the verdict, the rhythm of Owen's life began to steady, though traces of the conflict still lingered in the air like the faint smell of smoke after a fire. The school buses stopped using his road, the yellow lines that had scarred the asphalt slowly fading under the rain. Marina Howell resigned from her position as HOA president under the guise of personal reasons, but everyone knew the truth. The board she once ruled with unchallenged authority fractured in her absence, members turning on each other as the county opened an investigation into their practices. Owen read about it in the local paper one morning over coffee, the headlines smaller than the story deserved, yet satisfying all the same. For the first time in months, he smiled without bitterness. The neighbors, who had once crossed the street to avoid him, now greeted him cautiously, their voices uncertain but tinged with guilt. Some apologized directly, others simply offered polite nods and quick waves, eager to forget their complicity. Owen didn't hold grudges. He had learned that fear of authority, of standing out, of being wrong, was stronger than malice. Most of them had followed Marina's lead because it was easier than questioning her. Still, he made no effort to rejoin their world. His peace didn't depend on their approval. One quiet evening, he rebuilt the gate that had been the center of so much chaos. The old one had been scratched, dented, worn by conflict. The new gate was heavier, forged steel with reinforced locks, but simple and elegant in design. As he tightened the final bolt, he felt a strange sense of ceremony, as though sealing away not just the road but the memory of the months spent fighting for it. When he stepped back to look at his work, the sun was setting, and the metal shimmered in a wash of gold. Later, he sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee, the same ritual he had once performed in solitude before everything began. The air was still, the forest alive with distant sounds. The wind moving through the trees, the faint call of an owl, the hum of crickets beginning their night chorus. For the first time in a long while, those sounds no longer carried tension. They were simply the sounds of life continuing, of peace reclaiming its ground. He thought about what the fight had cost him: time, sleep, trust in others. Yet beneath the exhaustion was something stronger, a quiet pride. He hadn't chosen this battle, but he had seen it through to the end, and in doing so, he had reminded himself that boundaries, once drawn with conviction, meant something. The land, the road, the house, they weren't just possessions. They were extensions of his dignity, proof that even in a world obsessed with control, one man could still stand firm and say no. As darkness settled, Owen locked the gate for the night, the sound of metal sliding into place sharp and final. He paused for a moment, listening to the soft echo fade into the stillness around him, then turned toward the house, the porch light casting a warm halo across the gravel. The road behind him lay empty and silent, stretching through the pines like a scar healed over. It no longer looked like a battlefield, it looked like home again.